Good afternoon, everyone. Now, in the last class, we talked particularly about, firstly, the Enlightenment thinkers, right? And talking about the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers, we saw that how, whether it was John Locke, or it was Rousseau, or it was Voltaire, or it was Montesquieu, all were criticizing a particular a particular aspect of the ruling structure, right? And one of the things that we talked about was that the 1500, that up till the 1500s to 1600s, what existed in medieval Europe was a system of organization where there was something that was called as absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy basically relied upon the idea that the king is supreme and that the right to rule to the king actually came was a divine right. And the legitimacy to the rule of the king was provided by whom? By the church, right? So there was partly a nexus of the church and the nobility, and the ruling elites. At the same point of time, there's something that we'll talk about today. Firstly, is feudalism and industrial revolution. Once we just discuss the few remaining portions of the American Revolution. We'll talk about feudalism and the Industrial Revolution as important aspects that had a important role in Europe at this point of time. So, by and large, during the medieval period, the forms of organization of economic and political life were very different. Feudalism was one of the major modes of organization of economic activity. The church had an overwhelming influence over the political affairs. The church itself was a powerful entity, both politically and economically. It had the right to collect land revenue on its own. It also could make laws. It could also partly play a judicial role as well. All of these things were questioned by the Enlightenment philosophers who were inspired by a number of developments in the scientific arena. And these developments were, for example, the discoveries of Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, or the discovery of the germ theory of disease, etc., which basically questioned the legitimacy of the explanations offered by the church for the events around us. So the discovery of the laws of gravitation, the discovery that it was not Earth but the sun at the center of the universe, all these scientific developments, on the one side questioned the legitimacy of the church, on the other side they laid the ground for questioning the whole idea of divine right to rule also. The political philosophers got inspired from these scientific developments and went ahead with questioning different aspects of the ruling structure. While Locke argued that the role of the state was to protect the life, liberty, and property of its subjects, and that is why the state came into existence. Rousseau gave the social contract theory, arguing that unless and until this contract was upheld by the state, the people had a right to overthrow the state. Thirdly, we talked about how Voltaire was the one who emphasized that the source of all evil in European society was the church, and there was a need to decrease the role of church in matters apart from religious affairs. And finally, lastly, we talked about Montesquieu, right? And the whole idea that the problem was not either in the church or in the monarchy. The problem was the absolute concentration of power in any one authority. And so the argument for the separation of powers. Right? So we talked about all of that. Then we went ahead and we started the discussion on the American Revolution. And discussing the American Revolution, we talked about the causes of the American Revolution, from the Anglo-French rivalry to the high burden of taxation imposed after the 7 Years' War of 1763, which was the imposition of the stamp tax, the townshend duties, the tea tax, as well as the strict enforcement of the Navigation Acts. All of this basically resulted in a high burden of taxation, a shift away from the policy of benign neglect that the British had followed towards its American colonial subjects from the 1650s onwards. So with the no threat of French interference, the British increased the burden of taxation on its American subjects to partly recover the high costs, or to partly recover from the high financial burden imposed by the wars itself. And at this point of time, the American subjects, which had been used to govern themselves largely on their own, opposed this imposition of excessive taxes and gave the slogan of no taxation without representation. The Boston Tea Party saw the questioning of the monopoly given to the East India Company over selling of tea in America. And this was followed by a retaliation and the slogan of no taxation without representation. However, the British government replied back with the coercive acts. And you see that from 1775-76 to 1783, there was a period where, with the French assistance, the Americans overthrew the British militarily. And also, without this French military as well as financial assistance, this overthrow would not have been possible. Okay. So it talked about all of these facts before, right? So these were the causes. Also, then we talked about the American Civil War and how it was related to two particular issues: the issues of slavery and the continuation of slavery in the southern states, which supported the practice of slavery, and the northern states, which had taken to industrialization and were not anyway very seriously dependent upon the practice of slavery by the 1860s. Also, we saw that the southern states interpreted that they had the right to secede from the Union, which was a voluntary one. The debate on both these issues is what led to the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Right. So, so we had written the causes of the American Civil War. We did not write down the consequences, right? So let's just write down the consequences. And also, there's one more point that we need to talk about, and that is the debate between mercantilism and capitalism. That's also something that we'll talk about. But let's first write down the consequences. So, in terms of the consequences of the American Civil War, in terms of the consequences of the American Civil War, it is firstly argued that with the 13th Amendment introduced after, with the 13th Amendment introduced after 1865, the US Constitution expressively prohibited the right to secede, even though the Union of States was a voluntary one. That's the first thing. Secondly, the second important thing was the American Civil War resulted in the eventual abolishment of slavery. The American Civil War resulted in the eventual abolishment of slavery. Resulted in the eventual abolishment of slavery. Thirdly, to tackle the opposition from the southern states, the expenditure to tackle the opposition from the southern states, the expenditure on the army was substantially increased. To tackle the opposition from the southern states, the expenditure on the army was substantially increased, and this vastly increased the size of the American army. And this vastly increased the size of the American army. Okay. So that was also one of the major consequences. And again, as I told you, the abolishment of slavery did not mean the grant of equal political or social rights to the black population. It's only that slave owning came to an end, and the practice of buying and selling slaves is something that comes to an end. Okay, so that's something that is there. Now, there's one more thing that we need to talk about. That's the last thing that we need to talk about the American Revolution, and that is the contradiction that existed between mercantilism and capitalism. Now, what is mercantilism firstly? See, if you remember, we talked about the economic impact of British rule, right? And we talked about the imposition of one-sided free trade, the imposition of one-sided free trade and the flooding of the Indian market with the British goods, right? And so that the balance of trade was usually in favor of the British as compared to Indians. So all those policies which were ultimately imposed with the aim of ensuring that the balance of trade is in favor of Britain is what are called as the various mercantilist policies. The aim of mercantilist policies was what? So that the ultimate aim was that the balance of trade is in favor of Britain, meaning that Britain would export more of finished goods. That would mean that as we talked before, gold would be something that would accumulate more and more within Britain because international trade would happen in gold, right? So basically the mercantilist policies were the ones which were pursued by whom? By the British state, right? And the state would pursue these policies so that the balance of trade is in its favor and there is a net influx of gold. So mercantilist policies were pursued by the state. However, capitalism is something that you talk about individual. Capitalism is something that is the system which basically emphasizes the individual ownership of property and individual entrepreneurship, right? The ability of individual to start their own businesses, flourish, make profits, etc. So, what do you see? That the American Revolution, we talked about in the American Revolution previously, that the American traders' interest was compromised because of the imposition of the Navigation Acts and because of the granting of monopoly to the East India Company. In the Navigation Acts, we said that if at all they had to sell their goods, they could sell it only to Britain or either sell it only to Britain or through Britain to other countries. So, in a way, the imposition of Navigation Acts went against the spirit of American capitalism. And at the same point of time, if this spirit went and if these ideas went against the spirit of American capitalism, why were they being imposed? To favor British mercantilism. So even in the causes of American Revolution, you can add this point or you can write this separately as well, that one of the central contradictions was also the focus of the British to push forward their mercantilist policies. But this often came in contradiction with the American capitalist initiatives and the result was that it compromised the interests of the trading and the American business community. Okay, so let's just write down this much first, and then we'll begin with a fresh topic, and that is Industrial Revolution and feudalism. Okay, and after that we'll start the French Revolution. Okay, Industrial Revolution is not that big a topic, but still is an important topic. Now, and there's a question asked also in 2014 or 15 in the mains examination that discussed the Industrial Revolution and why did it begin in Europe and specifically in England. Okay, so that's something that we'll talk about. Now, the contradiction between American capitalism and British mercantilism. The contradiction between American capitalism and British mercantilism could also be seen as a major, cause for outbreak of the American Revolution. The British mercantilist policies basically involved a series of measures imposed by Britain upon its colonial subjects to ensure a one-sided free trade, with the objective to ensure one-sided free trade with the objective of ensuring with the objective of not ensuring sorry with the objective of developing a positive balance of trade in Britain's favor. This would result in a net influx of bullion or gold in Britain. For example, the strict implementation of Navigation Act from 1860s, the grant of monopoly in tea trade to the East India Company were directed to serve these mercantilist aims. However, these mercantilist policies often came in contradiction. These mercantilist policies often came in contradiction with the interests of American traders and businessmen whose economic activities were compromised, because whose economic activities were compromised because of denial of trading rights, routes, and privileges. Thus, thus stifling the growth of American capitalism premised on individual ownership and initiatives. Clear? So, written? Okay. So, basically, thus, you see that's all that we need to remember. Now, the next topic, and this is a question that was asked in, in your mains examination also before. It's a very simple, straightforward question. As discussed, the characteristics of the Industrial Revolution, the causes of it, and why did it originate why did it first happen in Britain? Okay. So now, to answer this, also at the same place we can discuss about feudalism. Okay. So feudalism, and because the shift is away from feudalism towards firstly the guild system and then towards capitalism. Now 680 to 1500 AD is the 600 AD to 1500 AD is the period where you see that the predominant mode of organizing economy in the European society was feudal structure. What happened in the feudal structure was predominantly that in the feudal structure, you see that predominantly there were, firstly there was the king. Below the king, there were a number of levels. Now we don't need to get into them. But ultimately, below the king, there were lords. And these lords were the ones who, some of them were the ones who were also given the title of knights. Okay? And other lords, but every lord also had was given a property. And this, the land property rights that every lord was given was given over a piece of land. And this landlord was also called as the, at times, feudal lord or also the meaner in some terms. Okay. Also, this land and the workers on this land were the ones who were called as the serf. Okay. Now, serfs were the ones who were tied to a piece of land. Meaning, for example, the king would grant the lordship to and again, here also you see there were three different classes of people. Okay. One was the church, which was completely separate. Then there were the nobles, who were appointed by the king. The king would grant them the rights over a particular land. And on this land, basically, the king, and to every piece of land, there were a number of serfs who were attached. Now, these serfs were their only obligation. Their obligation was to serve as, their obligation was to provide labor on these pieces of land. So the serfs were the ones who were predominantly responsible for agriculture. But apart from the serfs also, in addition to serf, they could also hire other labor also, which was, either the tenants or those who were hired on daily wages for performing agricultural work. So it was a mixture of serfs and tenants. Serfs, partly some land was even given by the lords to tenants, that you can cultivate this land on our behalf and you give us a share of the produce. Also, some wage laborers were also hired. So it was a mixture. So somebody had, say, 1,000 hectares of land. Then probably a part of the land would be cultivated by the serfs, another part would be cultivated by the wage labor, another part could be rented out to another tenant. Okay, so there was a mixture of many things. In this feudal structure, the reliance upon serf labor was huge. Okay, so basically a serf was tied to a piece of land. Now, what is important to understand is that the serf is never the one who's getting displaced. Rather, the serf provides labor for this carrying out this agriculture. Now, what would happen was that if at all a lord was transferred from one area to another, then the serfs were not transferred. The serfs would continue to occupy the same piece of land. And the new lord which would come, he would again be the one who would be appointed here, but the serfs would by and large continue to be the same. So what basically happened was that irrespective of whoever was the lord or whoever was the king, the serf was tied to the piece of land. Okay, and so basically land and serf, both of them came together. Okay, and the serfs are not like slaves. Why? Because they cannot be bought and sold in the market. Okay, so the serfs cannot be bought and sold in the market. Slavery was also there up till a point of time, but the serfs, that's another thing. Slaves also provided some labor, but slavery was abolished in Britain much earlier. Okay, so but you see, the serfs were attached to the piece of land. Now, what would happen was that the predominant mode of organization of economic life was predominantly rural. Okay, and it was predominantly rural and agrarian. And feudalism was the dominant form of organization of economic life. There was, apart from what went to the king and what was left for the lord and for the serfs, there was little surplus production. And you see that surplus production was not something which was a very strong feature. And most of the economic activity was agrarian. The growth of urban industry, the growth of industries, the growth of guilds was yet to pick up till 1500. Up till 1300, after which the growth of guilds also actually began. What are guilds? We'll talk about. So basically, there are little and small urban centers and not very big urban centers or very big traders also. However, as the population started increasing, and also with incremental improvements in agrarian technology, you see that surplus production slowly started picking up. With surplus production started happening, the amount of labor required in agriculture actually underwent a decline. Because the productivity of the land increased. Why? Because of introduction of new equipments. For example, firstly they had mud equipments, then they had wooden equipments, then they had those that were made from iron, copper, etc. So you see that as the quality of implements improved, the productivity increased. Productivity increased, meaning that now there was less requirement of labor for agrarian purposes. And so you see a diversification away from agrarian agriculture to other economic activities, and you see the building of the guild, G-U-I-L-D, the guild system. Now, what was there in the guild system? In the guild system, basically what was there was that, have we talked about the guild before? No. Okay. So a guild system was a kind of a system in which basically there were a number of guilds. So for example, there would be a guild of goldsmiths. There would be a guild of ironsmiths. There would be a guild of doctors. There would be a guild of lawyers. So etc. Okay. So for every for every economic activity, there was a specialized group of individuals who were responsible for providing that product or that service. So, for example, lawyers also had a guild, goldsmiths also had a guild, or ironsmiths also had a guild, or potters also had a guild. Okay, so for every other non-agrarian purpose, either product or service, there was a guild. And basically, it was only this guild which had the responsibility and the authority to produce a good. Meaning that, for example, a guild of ironsmiths would have 500 members. Only these 500 members were given the permission to produce goods of iron. Okay, only they could make equipments out of iron. Only they had the know-how, and only they were legally allowed to produce these goods. Now, what did the guild system allow? The guild system firstly allowed the members of these guild to closely guard the entry of new members into the guild. So basically, a guild could be expanded only with the consent of the members of the guild. Okay, only the members of the guild could give a permission to include new members within the guild. Okay, so basically it was one of the ways by which the guild prevented or checked the entry of new members, only allowing those that they wished to grant an entry to, only they could get an entry into the guild. Also, the guild was to determine the total production level, meaning how much amount of a good is to be produced. Okay, and why was this important? To determine how much amount of good was to be produced, to partly meet the demand in the economy, and also to ensure that the value of the goods produced does not undergo a decline. हमेशा आप क्या कहते हैं that prices decline when the supply increases. So they would also try to regulate the supply in the manner that the economic return for the guild was always high. Okay, so the guilds would often also, on the one side, restrict the entry of new entrants into the guild. On the other side, it would keep a tab on the production levels so as to ensure a continual payment of a rich dividend, that there is always a demand for their goods in the market. Okay, that is what was sought to be introduced. Okay, and basically you see that the guild system thus was a feudalism was for agrarian structure. Guild system was for non-agrarian purposes, manufacturing as well as for some services. Okay, so the guild system was for manufacturing predominantly and also for some services. What it allowed was a diversification into non-agrarian areas, but it also had its limitations. Firstly, it restricted the entry of new members and subjecting it to the consent of the existing members of the guild, and thus often this consent would not come for anybody who was not closely related to the existing members of the guild. So this was something that promoted nepotism. Okay, at the same point of time, apart from this, also given the fact that it was not the demand and supply which would regulate, it was not the demand in the market which would regulate the production of goods, it was the target set by the guild themselves, that it also was unable to keep up with the high demand for a variety of goods. So though the guild system was the one which also saw a movement towards urbanization, growth of urban centers, rise of trading communities, growth of new professions, it was soon visible that the guild system was insufficient to meet the demands of the society. And thus you see a movement thus away from the guild system, finally towards a period of industrial revolution. Okay. Now what is the industrial revolution? We define industrial revolution as particularly, and don't worry, we'll write up, okay, that we define industrial revolution particularly as an era of mass production which was based upon a mechanized means of production. Okay, an era of mass production which was based upon a mechanized means of production. Now, the industrial revolution is something that is said to have begun from 1757 onwards, and this era of industrial production, this era of industrial revolution required a series of scientific and technical advances. Okay, and these advances had begun from the 1750s onwards, and that is why we say that the industrial revolution began from 1750s onward. Now, for example, a series of technological developments happened. One of the first primary important major technological development was the development, even before the development of the steam engine, the development of and a movement towards the establishment of the flying shuttle. Okay, that as we had discussed when we were discussing Indian history, that India was one of the world's biggest textile producers before the Industrial Revolution. But from 1750s onwards, on the first side, when even in 1740s, for the first time they discovered the flying shuttle. They invented the flying shuttle, which was basically a form of handloom only, but which was used to use hydropower to run these machines to produce textile goods. Then, over a period of time, it was realized that more efficiency can be brought in these textile industries if we move towards what were called as the power looms. Okay, and you see, but for the development of power looms, one important ingredient that was required was energy. Okay, and this energy was thought to be developed or brought with the development of the steam engine. Okay, and the steam engine was something which was one of the critical intermediaries of the industrial revolution, because it was to provide cheap power which would fuel machines or which would drive machines. So it was a critical intermediary which was required for bringing in an era of machine based mass production. So one was the development of machines, but these development of machines would also depend upon the availability of adequate as well as cheap power. And for development of adequate and cheap power, coal-based steam power was considered as one of the most important scientific developments. And we'll talk about what is guiding this development in a while, but let's first see what happened. Now, with the development of these coal-based, steam engines, firstly by Thomas Newcomen, which was later improved upon by James Watt by 1850s, you see that the steam engine was developed, which engineered a change in a number of industries. For example, the textile industry saw the development of the power loom. Okay, and power loom was something that did not have to be run by hand, but was run by energy, by steam energy, and that basically increased the speed of production of goods. Okay, at the same point of time, this steam engine was also modified to allow faster movements of goods and people with the development of the railways. And for the development of railways also you required steam engine. Also for mining purposes, for carrying out deep excavation also, steam engines were modified and used. So even for mining purposes, for taking out raw materials, etc., also the steam engines were used. So again, this was one development which was modified in a number of ways to bring about development in the textile sector. And Britain embarked upon a rapid development of the textile sector, the development of the railways, the development of the mining industry. All of this got fueled 1750s onwards because of these advances. Now, there's some of the developments that we'll write about. But another part of the question is that why did the Industrial Revolution begin only in Britain? Okay, and the reason that was given for the beginning of the Industrial Revolution only in Britain were, or what explained that why the Industrial Revolution only began in Britain. There are a number of factors. The two most important factors were, firstly, the fact that in Britain there was a acute shortage of labor. Okay, or the cost of labor was was highest in Britain in the 1750s throughout the world. And why was the cost of labor high is another matter that we'll talk about. But what you see is that whether it was in Asia, okay, and in Asia during the 1700s, before the British came, the Indian economy as well as the Chinese economy were almost at a similar level to the European economy. And their contribution to the world GDP was almost similar, and world trade was almost similar to that of Europe. But what is seen is that during the 1700s, the way the Indian economy and the Chinese economy flourished was very different from the way the British economy had flourished. Despite that, almost till the 1700s, all had a relatively equal share of world trade in GDP. What was there was that in India, the labor was always surplus and cheap. Okay, and so the surplus and cheap availability of labor meant that there was no shortage of workers, and given the surplus and cheap availability of labor, the cost of production was not high. Okay, but in Britain, with the development of the Industrial Revolution, and even before the Industrial Revolution itself, by 1740s itself, the cost of labor had increased dramatically. Okay, and it was almost 4 to 5 times more than that was in India. The result was that there was a demand. Why was the cost of labor high? Because slavery had been abolished by then, which was one of the ways of having cheap labor. So that was something that was abolished, and anyways the population was less. And so you see that there was a urge or a search for new technologies which could lower the cost of production, and specifically the dependence upon high cost labor. Okay, and that was one of the main necessities which drove a search for mechanization, and which necessitated a search for development of new machines, which would decrease the number of workers required. However, there was never a search for these labor saving mechanization in India or in China because of the surplus availability of cheap labor. That was one of the causes. The other was the availability of low cost and good quality coal very near the surface. Very near the surface. For example, the mines, the early coal mines in Britain were not very deep. Rather, they could even in a manual manner could take out a lot of coal. They did not have very big mines. Okay, because cheap and good quality coal was available very much near the surface. And this meant that not just that meant that the cost of fuel was less, whereas the cost of labor was high. So both of these ways to move away from high cost labor and to increase and to depend upon low cost fuel, you see the development of these machines. Okay, so these were some of the conditions which facilitated. There are a few other conditions also which are said to have facilitated the growth of industrial revolution in Britain, and that is the presence of a stable political democratic system which allowed individual ownership of property. If you remember, we had discussed in history, in modern Indian history, that the British brought in the idea of the right to property. So their open political structure, which also allowed individual ownership of property, gave incentive to people to develop free enterprise to accumulate more and more wealth. And that is also what motivated a number of individual efforts to push ahead industrialization. So that's also one of the explanations which is given as to why Britain developed, the industrial revolution first. So these are some of the, ones that we say are the reasons for the industrial revolution. Now, but what is the impact of industrial revolution? Let's for a few minutes also talk about the impact of industrial revolution. Now, the impact of industrial revolution first was urbanization and massive urbanization, because industrialization saw a shifting to a factory-based setup of production. Before industrial revolution, in the guild system or in other systems of production, basically the production would happen in the backyard of the house. Okay, and the goods would be later sold in the market. But a centralized, machine-based, factory-based system of production came only with the industrial revolution. So large factories were set up in urban areas where workers migrated from rural areas primarily to work in these industries. So wage-based production in large factory-based setups spurred urbanization and a rural to urban migration. And that is why the first urbanizations that happened throughout the world were promoted by industrial revolution. And Britain was one of the first countries in the world to witness urbanization due to the industrial revolution. But this urbanization then was not like urbanization that you see in European countries today. Rather, urbanization brought a series of problems. And 1750s to 1800s, for example, despite industrialization, despite urbanization, the life expectancy, I mean, this is something that many people don't know, that the life expectancy in urban centers in Britain actually declined from 1750s to 1800s because of the poor living conditions in these urban centers. There was a rapid proliferation of slums. The worker hours were poorly regulated, and the workers would often work from 10 to 12 to 14 hours. Also, the wages were low. There was little or no availability of safe sanitation and safe drinking water supply, which also often resulted in the outbreak of a number of epidemics, okay, like the cholera, typhoid, etc. Okay, and also because of the overwhelming reliance upon coal-powered industries, there was also a lot of pollution. Okay, so the quality and the standard of living in these early urban centers was not that good. And that was also one of the negative consequences of the industrial revolution. Positive, humko pata hai that it spurred industrialization, brought in era of mass production, all of that. But what you see is that there is also this negative flip side or the adverse consequence of the industrial revolution. And that is why you also see during the 1750s to 1800s a number of strikes. And when Marx was, writing about the challenges of capitalism, he was basically looking upon the plight of the workers in Britain and during the Industrial Revolution. So there were positives also, but there were negatives also. And industrialization, one last reason why industrialization could flourish in Britain initially was also the existence of a large number of colonies, which provided both assured raw material and an assured market for their goods. That's all that you need to know about the Industrial Revolution. Okay, it's a small topic, but nonetheless, it combines feudalism as well as how you see a movement from feudalism away to guild system, ultimately to even a mode of Industrial Revolution. Okay, so that's something. Let's first, yeah.
Modern India history, you said one point that after the Industrial Revolution, Britain was not able to produce, immediately was not able to produce good quality and cheaper goods. And the incentives provided by the government helped it to flourish. Could this be written as a reason for in Britain? The incentives.
So, what you're saying is that, as I told in modern Indian history, that for the first couple of decades after 1757, the efficiency of these British industries was not that great, and they relied upon the protectionist policies followed by the state in providing them an assured market within Britain, and even in pushing their goods. So yes, there is a role of state policy as well, and that is also something that you can write as a reason for the growth of industries. Okay, but in fact, a lot of these reasons actually do not answer. There are some of these reasons which are explanations, but none of these explanations is a single explanation which is sufficient enough to say why industrial revolution happened only in Britain to begin with. So I also don't have an answer for this. Okay, I just have these many points. These are what are written everywhere. Okay, इसके आगे आपकी कोई खोज होगी तो मुझको भी बताइए. Okay, so that's there. Now, let's firstly write down this much, then we'll take whatever doubts you have after this, okay? Feudalism and Industrial Revolution. 600 to 1500 AD was the period which saw 600 to 1500 AD was the period which saw the feudal system as the predominant method of organization of rural agrarian, saw the feudal system as the predominant method of organization of rural agrarian life. The feudal system was composed of a feudal lord or manor who was granted the control over land by the king. These lands were to be served by the labor of serfs. These lands were to be served by the labor of serfs who were tied to a particular land. The feudal structure often produced little or no surplus produce, often produced or often resulted in one and the same thing, often resulted in little or no surplus produce, and thus failed to increase productivity or spur trade activities. Spur trade activities. However, with increasing population, advent of new equipments which resulted in increasing agricultural productivity, which resulted in increasing agricultural productivity. Increasing population, advent of new equipments, which resulted in increasing agricultural productivity, and okay, yeah. So with new equipments, which resulted in increase in agricultural productivity, and thus provided surplus labor for non-farm activities. The growth of guild system was witnessed from 1500 onwards. The guild system was a closed system of organization of labor. The guild system was a closed system of organization of labor. Was a closed system of organization of labor into specialized production groups which were the key to production of a number of non-agrarian goods such as iron equipments, uh, pottery, jewelry, and other products. However, two major two major deficiencies of the guild system saw that they found themselves unable to meet the ever increasing demand for goods. These were A. The restrictions on the entry of new members within a guild. The restrictions on entry of new members within a guild. The guild members exercised a complete monopoly largely restricting the entry of new individuals into a guild without the consent of existing members. Thus, nepotism flourished within the guild system and hampered development of new initiatives and technologies. Because new members were not allowed entry, so new members could have come up with new ideas, etc., and that would have flourished, that would have boosted production, but that was not allowed. The second reason was the strict enforcement of production targets. The strict enforcement of production targets artificially aimed at maintaining a high market price for the produce artificially aimed at maintaining a high market price for the produce by inducing a scarcity within the, by inducing a scarcity of goods within the market. This scarcity was produced as supply restrictions enforced by guilds often meant that demand outstripped supply. So these are the reasons also for the failure of the guild system. Okay? These are the reasons for the failure of the guild system. अगर आपको पूछ ले that what were the reasons that or if at all the question comes that what were the reasons which forced the shift away from feudal structure towards guild system, or which forced the shift away from feudal structures towards industrial revolution, then you can write a brief point or two about the guild system also. Now, what is industrial revolution and factors that led to its growth in Britain? Industrial revolution could be defined as the introduction of a period of mechanized mass production of goods in a factory based setup since the 1750s. The growth of industrial revolution depended upon a series of technological advances such as A, the development of flying shuttle by John Key in 1740s, which was later improved upon and coupled with steam power to develop the power loom by 1780s. 1775-80, that is where you see the development of the power loom. B, the development of steam engine by Thomas Newcomen and later improved by James Watt. provided a source of powering a number of machines developed during this period. See, the development of railways powered by steam engine also provided a key input to move goods and raw material cheaply over long distances. Over long distances. All of this is basically what you see promoted. All of this is basically what you see promoted the growth of and was all of these were the characteristics of scientific advances which promoted the industrial revolution. Now the factors. The factors that promoted, we're writing briefly, okay? Now, factors are A, the high cost of labor in Britain. The high cost of labor in Britain. After the abolishment of slavery, the labor costs in Britain increased dramatically. For example, the cost of labor was at least 5 times. The cost of labor in Britain was at least 5 times that of in India. B, the availability of good quality coal. The availability of good quality cheap coal near the surface. The availability of good quality near the surface. That's for my tea, not for you. So, the availability of good quality cheap coal near the surface is something which allowed near the surface was which allowed the powering of these machines with assured and cheap energy. The third major reason is The third major reason okay. So third is the third was basically the presence of a unified political state that incentivized individual ownership of property, providing enough incentive providing enough incentive providing enough incentive for promotion of capitalist enterprise. Also, another reason that is given apart from these reasons for the growth of industrial revolution there is the promotion of protectionist policies which secured the British market for indigenous producers, protecting from the promotion of protectionist policies which secured the British market for indigenous producers, protecting from competition from Asian economies. And fifth, the vast colonial expanse provided a cheap supply of raw material and an assured market for finished goods. All these are the reasons why you see the growth of industrial revolution. Clear? Now, after this, the consequences I'm not writing, I'm just told that to you for your understanding. That you see a number of repeated strikes, you see rapid urbanization, you see unplanned urbanization, see, and all of this information can be used. Suppose you're writing an essay on urbanization, okay, and you're talking about sustainable urbanization. And then you see that one of the constant things is what? That urbanization is often coterminous with industrialization, right? And historically, you see that many countries in Europe have also faced similar problems and challenges with urbanization that we also face today. So the history and trajectory of urbanization and the challenges associated with it are not something which were to come as a surprise, but were or could have been foreseen, given the fact that we were moving towards industrialization. And there is a need to ensure that urbanization happens in a manner that ensures the welfare of the workers, that ensures the welfare of those living within it, and thus ensure that the benefits of industrialization reach the workers and the masses who live in these urban centers as well. Okay, so that's there. Yeah, you had a doubt. Hmm. Just a second. Education system of? Huh. Huh, huh. Hmm. See, there is no, so yeah, I mean, you can say that there's, sir, in terms of education also, the presence of an educated workforce, even technological developments, etc., they also help. So there's no end to what you can keep adding to the list. But these are some of the more important ones, okay, which are considered as the key drivers, okay, because because these are the ones on which there is more consensus. Because otherwise, it's also very difficult to say what is the cause and what is the effect, or what was simply just there, and whether correlation is actually causation also or not. Okay, so that's that's there. Anything else? Yeah.
How this guild system come to an end?
How did the guild system come to an end?
Is it India's promotion of industrial group that time?
See, why and how did the guild system come to an end was simply because it could not keep up with the demand. It could not keep up with the demand, and even there was a resentment against the fact that the guild system restricted the entry of new individuals into any particular profession. So basically what started happening was that the enforceability of the guild system actually getting compromised over a period of time, where people started violating the guild. Okay, even if the guild was not giving certification, people started going out on their own and started producing goods. And given that the demand was there, so you see that this guild system soon, slowly and slowly fell out of favor. And so the guild system continued, but slowly and slowly the development of new industries, new methods of production meant that the guilds themselves were sidelined. There was no overthrow or anything of the guild system. It's just that they were outcompeted by others who refused to be, left the pursuit to be a part of guilds and started production on their own. Okay, that's it.
After the industrial revolution, the guild system come to an end.
Yeah, the guild system during or before even the growth of the industrial revolution, the guild system was declining, and with industrial revolution picking up, obviously the guilds were outcompeted. Okay? Yeah, yeah.
To what extent European class system was similar to Indian caste system?
European class and Indian caste system, ये आप social issues में पढ़ेंगे. It's not my job to compare feudalism with with other aspects of caste. फिर अभी caste race चालू हो जाएगा. So that these are all social issues. Leave it to social issues and you discuss it there. I can also discuss it, but the point is time. We have other things to cover as well. अब social issues में बहुत time मिलेगा ये cover करने का. Okay. So that's there. Anything else? What is exactly the structure of guild? देखिए exactly structure यही था कि एक guild एक committee होती थी. उसमें there were a number of members. There were some who were the decision makers of the guild. They would set the production targets for the guild. They would also consider applications for entry of new members into the guild. And so these were centralized. For example, आप देखिए, there's Medical Council of India. Okay, there's MCI. Okay, or there is the Bar Council of India. Or they're not exactly guides today. They're not guides actually. But I'm just saying that आप ऐसा कुछ सोच लीजिए. That is how it used to exist there. That they would restrict the entry, that they would certify the entry of new people, and they would also set the production targets. Okay. So that's how, and these decisions were taken as by the leaders of a particular guild.
There was a concept of master of the guild.
Huh.
Master person and the other various followers of the master.
Huh.
So what was that concept?
See, that's what I'm saying, that this is the concept, that there was a central committee. Okay, and basically there was a central committee which decided this. Then within every guild, if a new person was to be inducted into a guild, he was to be trained. How was this individual to be trained? Okay, this individual was trained by being appointed them to a particular master. They would be serving as something that you can understand as an intern today. They would learn on the job. So somebody who would become an ironsmith, he would be appointed to a particular individual who was already a member of the guild, who would serve as a worker within that particular guild. Slowly he would take the skills on the job and would then be given the independent status of a member of the guild. That is how they would induct new members, giving them the training once they were formally inducted into the guild. Okay? Yeah.
The system came to an end. Was there some social revolution or it just shifted from
The feudal system, how did the feudal system came to an end? There were demands for abolition of feudalism in a number of European countries from time to time, including in Britain. Britain was one of the first countries to abolish feudalism because there was a demand that this was extremely exploitative for the serf, who was to give unpaid labor. Okay, they're not paid anything. The serf would just keep some part of the produce for themselves. Okay, the rest would go to the lord. So they were predominantly unpaid labor. This was some kind of a semi-slavery kind of a system. Not exactly slavery because they're not being bought and sold in the market, but there is some form of extremely exploitative economic exercise where the workers, where the serfs were not paid any wages. Okay, and so there were there was a constant demand to end feudalism throughout Europe, including in Britain. First, slavery was abolished, and after that, feudalism was abolished, primarily because of these social demands. And Britain was again one of the first ones to do so. And by 1860s, you see almost every other country has abolished feudalism, Russia being one of the last ones to abolish feudalism. Right? Scientific revolution could be considered as a cause leading to the end of feudalism. Not exactly, because scientific revolution was something which was more about the developments in the field of the natural sciences, and feudalism was predominantly a social practice. Yeah, but those ideas which questioned of the scientific revolution and the spirit of the scientific revolution, which questioned a number of other practices, were predominantly about the ruling structure. They were not too much about either the practice of slavery or the idea of feudalism also. Okay, so their impact was more upon applying. देखिए उसका फंडा सिंपल सा इतना था that scientific developments. For example, Newton discovered the laws of the universe. That is how the universe or the physical world operated. So a number of social scientists and political philosophers said that we would want to uncover the laws of the social universe. So जैसे physical universe के अपने laws हैं, probably social universe also has their own laws. They just need to be discovered. So basically they said that these ideas we will apply to discover what should be the structure of rule. Okay, and which is the best structure of ruling. Okay, that is what they said.
to an abrupt end or it gradually?
The feudal system did not come to an abrupt end. Though, though there were attempts to end it, but it did not come to an abrupt end. It slowly and slowly moved away. Why? Because more and more was the demand for abolition of the feudal system. One of the things also that I've not told you is that there was an enclosure movement. Okay. Yeah, there were many things. I mean, there was a movement away already from, because there was surplus labor, right? Because there was surplus labor, because productivity was increasing. So the dependence upon serfs also was decreasing. Okay, so there was the dependence upon serfs was also decreasing, and there was a demand for labor in non-agrarian activities. So that is why feudalism also declined. Also, there was also something that was called the enclosure movement. That's not needed exactly, which also pushed a number of, led to a decline in the practice of feudalism in the agrarian structure. Okay, and that is why slowly over a period of time, you see it's ending and you see a movement towards the guild and then the capitalist system, industrial revolution. Yeah.
There was a problem of this flow system, like king and lords. लॉर्ड्स रिस्पांसिबल सिर्फ किंग के लिए होते थे और वो पर्सनली डिसेंट्रलाइज्ड पावर थी और सरप्लस का प्रॉब्लम था. लीडिंग फैक्टर्स हो सकते हैं
लीडिंग
एंड ऑफ feudalism.
Yeah, I mean these things. One of the central things, as I told, was that the limited produce That the absence of surplus production was one of the reasons why feudalism was lagging behind. Also, there were other factors as well, that every subordinate within the different levels was responsible only to their superior. Ultimately, this also basically was partly responsible for an absence of a very strong, swift, centralized structure of ruling. So that's also one of the reasons which is given. But the major reason also why we say that neither feudalism nor the guild system survived, predominantly because they were unable to keep with the demands of the market, or they were unable to, unable to keep with the overall demands over the changing period of centuries. That's there. Okay. So now anything else? Clear? Okay. Now the next thing that we're going to talk about is the French Revolution.
You were saying that you will write about the adverse effects of industrial revolution.
Okay, consequences of industrial revolution. Firstly, it increased the space, increased the pace of urbanization. It also saw the proliferation of slums. It also saw long working hours, low wages, absence of any healthcare benefits, and thus provoked repeated strikes in industries. Industrial revolution also further fueled a search for mass markets and colonization itself. It was partly favored by the availability of mass markets, and the more the production increased, the more was the search for, markets, okay, for newer markets. So partly it actually spurred the growth of search for mass markets and colonization.
But the wages in compared to the Indian workers are good enough.
See, what happens is that the wages to the Indian workers are good enough, but they're not comparing themselves to the Indian worker. Okay? Now, the wages are low in what context? The wages are low in context that they would often have to work for 12 to 14 hours. And the per hour wages were very low. Okay? That was not enough to actually maintain a decent standard of living. Okay? So that is why, yes, the wages are higher than what are being paid in India, but that is in their context not enough.
5 times higher than the.
Yeah, I mean, but for example, one of the things also happens with urbanization is that the cost of living increases. Okay, and that is why here you see that with the increasing wages, with the wages which were low, there was always, because they wanted, the industry owners wanted to keep the wages as low as possible. But that also did not mean that the wages were as low as that was there in India, right? So yes, at the end of the day, as compared to Indians, the wages were enough. But as compared to maintaining the adequate standard of living there, the wages were relatively low.
So in college we write that because of the high wages and the industrial revolution flourished.
Okay. So it's a very standard question. कि सर कभी तो हाई हो जाती है वेज, कभी तो लो हो जाती है. So what is the exact, एक बार को डिसाइड कर लेते हैं, okay, कि हाई है कि लो है, right? So see, what you need to understand that wages are often one thing which keep changing over a period of time. And in fact, as industrialization proceeds in any country, okay, the wages increase, and the cost of labor keeps increasing. For example, you take a new example, it will explain it to you everything. China. 1980s wages were lower, 1990s wages were lower. Since 2000s, the wages started to increase. Now with industrialization, though China had surplus labor, huge amount of surplus labor, and still the wages started to increase. Why? Because with industrialization, there is a growth of urbanization. And with growth of urbanization, the cost of living also increases. And when the cost of living increases, though the wages have improved from before, but these wages are not sufficient enough to maintain the same standard of living. Thus, what happens is that there is a demand for increasing wages even further. And as wages keep on increasing even further, there is outsourcing. That you start shifting your production base to other countries, looking where is a lower wage available already. Okay. So for example, though in 1750s they're setting up industries here. If you remember in Indian history, we said that by 1850s, the cost of labor, cost of production increased dramatically in Britain. And so they shifted production to India. Okay. So low end cost is always a relative term, and it is evolving over a period of time, which keeps varying with the cost of living and the degree of industrialization. So it's not कि वो जो low है, वो हमेशा low है, या high या low का जो concept है, that will keep changing over time. Okay. That wages, we say, when we say कि the wages are higher, what the wages were higher in Britain, and that fueled industrial revolution, I am comparing it with Asia. Asian wages were lower, European wages were higher. But when I'm saying low here, I am saying the wages were not high enough to maintain an adequate standard of living. Clear? Okay. So that wages, low wages, that high wages that we were talking of as a cause for fueling industrial revolution is as compared to the Asians. And here low wages are not, the wages are not high enough to maintain an adequate standard of living. Clear? Okay. Now finally, let's start with industrial revolution. Sorry, French Revolution. Now, yeah. So the first thing that we are going to talk of in the French Revolution are the causes of the French Revolution itself. This is not something that is very difficult to understand. Okay. Now, the first thing to know about the causes of the French Revolution is, firstly, the fact that France was a monarchy at this point of time. Okay, and in terms of causes, we'll again, write the political causes, the economic causes, the causes related to the army, and social causes. The four categories, which our staple has always been. Okay, so we'll write in those format also. Don't worry, we'll write them together. Now, firstly, there are a few things you understand as the background. The structure of the French society. The structure of French society was one where there were three estates. The first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. The first estate was the one where you personally see, the first estate was the one where you see was the clergy. Or the clergy were the ones who were associated with the church. It was the clergy which provided sanction to the rule of the king, and also provided sanction to the rule of the king and the nobility, who would often be considered as the second estate. Okay, so the first and the second estates were also called as the ruling classes. The clergy and the nobility were also the ones which were called as the ruling classes. Also, below the second estate were the third estate. And the third estate was actually a conglomeration. It was not, so the first estate is the church, the second estate is the nobility. The nobility included those who were the large landlords. The big landlords, etc., were the ones who were the part of the nobility. The third estate was essentially a conglomerate or a heterogeneous group of a variety of different occupational groups. It included the landless peasant. It included the small tenant, landless peasant who would work on a piece of land of the landlord, or the small tenant who would take small pieces of land on on a monthly basis or a yearly basis by the big landlord, or it also included, and these were predominantly the agrarian workers, but it also, the third estate also included the educated middle class. And the educated middle class included professions and professionals such as lawyers, doctors, etc. Okay, so these people were the ones also who were a part of the third estate. Now, the first and the second estate were the ruling classes, and they did not pay any taxes. The first estate formed roughly 1% of the population. The second estate also formed roughly 1% of the population. And though they formed only 2% of the population, they had almost 60% of the wealth. Okay, so they had almost 60% of the wealth, and this wealth was not taxed. The third estate was the one which had 40% of the wealth, 98% of the population, and bore all the taxes. Okay. Now, so what is the first thing was a very narrow base of taxation. Though the masses were taxed, but the majority of wealth was not taxed. Okay. So, firstly, the base, and yeah, economics may, even if you've read or not read, it does not matter. But basically, you see that the wider is the base of taxation, the better it is. The better is the yield of taxes, right? So that is why GST, all of that, widening the base of taxation and all of that. So basically, the French society had a narrow base of taxation. On top of that, the burden of taxes was high on the third estate. Why? Because the base was narrow. Right? So the burden of taxation was high. The king would impose taxes, even the king would impose taxes, even the church could impose taxes. So the first and second estates could also impose additional taxes apart from the land revenue tax, etc., which was often collected on a regular basis. Also, apart from this, the French society was, the French ruling structure was actually a monarchy, which was under the control of the Bourbon dynasty. Okay, and the Bourbon dynasty were the ones who had been ruling France for almost a couple of centuries. Okay, and at this point of time during the 1780s, it is King Louis XVI who is ruling France. तो उनका लुई ऐसे चलता था कि लुई 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 12, इतना कोई कंफ्यूजन नहीं है, बस एक नाम है, उसमें नंबर बढ़ता जाता है. Okay, so King Louis XVI was the one in charge of the Bourbon dynasty at that point of time in France. Also, what is to be understood was that before 1630, for imposing any new taxes, any new major tax, for imposing any new tax before 1630, you see that, in fact, 1614 to be more precise actually, before 1614, for imposing any new tax on the third estate, a parliament had to be convened by the king, which was called as the Estates General. The first estate, the second estate, and the third estate, all of them had to convene in a parliament which had to approve the imposition of any new substantial taxes by the king. But this practice of convening the Estates General, which would be a kind of a semi-parliament where representatives from first, second, and third estates would come, was discontinued after 1614. And you see that no Estates General was reconvened from 1614 to 1789. Okay, almost for 170 years, no fresh Estates General was reconvened, and the monarchy kept on imposing new kinds of taxes. And so the burden of taxation was high. Also, one of the things was that the French and the Anglo-French rivalry saw huge expenditures on war from 1740s to 60s. Then, again during the American Revolution, a huge expenditure. And though on the one side the base was narrow, the expenditures on the armed front were huge. On top of that, what was another problem was that the French had still not witnessed the Industrial Revolution, though Britain had embarked upon Industrial Revolution from the 1750s onwards. But even till the 1790s, no major Industrial Revolution had picked up in France. Even in agricultural productivity, there was no substantial increase in agricultural productivity, and repeated droughts and famines actually struck France. And during the 1780s, there were a number of these factors which came together. Already they were dealing with a high financial burden of supporting the American War of Independence. On top of that, 1780s was the period where a number of successive droughts and famines were witnessed. And because of these droughts and famines, you see that during the 1780s, because of these droughts and famines, again, the prices went up high, food inflation picked up dramatically, and there were repeated food shortages. Okay, and also, so that was there. Also, one of the things within the social structure, also that we have not talked about till now, is that just like in Britain, even in France, there was a guild system. Okay, that on the one side, you know, there was a movement away from feudalism, but there was still not industrial revolution. France was in the middle of somewhere with the guild system. And the guild system also suffered, the guild system basically closely guarded the entry of new people into the profession. So basically, even not just the first and the second estates were socially of a higher status. Even, so, and in fact, the socially higher status of the first and second estate was also reflected in the fact that there was no rule of law. In fact, for the first and the second estate could escape punishment for any particular crime by paying a small financial fine. For example, the church could issue the letter of indulgences, and with these with these letter of indulgences that the church issued, any individual from the first and second estate who had committed a sin, either had committed a crime, a robbery, a sin, a murder, whatever, from a small to a big crime, whatever be the nature of crime, they could escape the penalty for that crime by paying a small fee, which would, with which they could obtain a letter of, they could obtain a formal letter from the church, which would, which would grant them, grant them a pardon because of these letter of indulgences. So basically, you could commit a crime, you could pay a small fine, and with this fine, you could buy a letter of indulgence, which would allow the church to pardon an individual from the first and second estate. So there was no equality before the law. And apart from no equality before the law, the guild system was such that it prevented the entry of new individuals within any particular profession. So even the freedom to practice any profession was not freely available. Okay, or the freedom to practice any profession was also not freely available. Why do you see that the Indian Constitution is talking of many of such things, equality before the law, the freedom and the right to practice a trade and profession of one's choice, right? All of that is, you know, partly coming from experiences, partly, and aisa nahi hai ki India did not have such problems. We had problems with the caste system, you know, a lot of these problems associated in our own way. So you see a similar problems were there as well. So that is why the French Revolution also talked about the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity, right? Social equality basically meant that this estate system, or, you know, this estate system must come to an end and there must be equality before the law. Liberty included the freedom to practice profession as well of one's choice. And fraternity also said that if you have liberty and equality, then only you can have fraternity, or a feeling of belongingness to one common community. Okay. So these were all the background factors. Now, how did the French Revolution began is something that we'll talk about. But another major role was that of the leadership of those associated with the army itself. Okay, and those associated with the armed forces, because those soldiers who had participated in the American Revolution to support the American Revolution argued that similar ideas must be replicated within the French society as well. Now, let's first, before we write down the causes, you'll write down a timeline with me. And once we write down the timeline, then we'll write down the causes. Okay. And this is for the period from 1789 to 1792. Okay, only for, or let's put it from 1789 to 1794. Okay, that's the period that we're writing about first. So, 1789 to 1794. Because of all these problems that I've just discussed with you, basically what happens is that by 1789, because of the high burden of taxation, because of food inflation, because of no liberty to practice a profession of one's choice, because of the unequal base of taxation and the high expenditure and the lavish expenditure of the monarchy on its own lifestyle, along with that of the army, basically you see that the French financial position had deteriorated. Backed by successive droughts during the 1780s, the food prices were also high. So in 1789, you see that the French king Louis the 16th considered imposing new additional taxes on the third estate. However, he was advised against increasing the burden of taxation on was advised against increasing the burden of taxation on the third estate any further. If he was given the advice by his finance minister, Jack Necker, okay, name is not important, but he was advised by his finance minister not to increase the burden of taxes any further on the third estate, rather increase the taxes on the first and impose taxes on the first and second estate. But the first and second estate were not very willing to subject to any taxes. Any taxes, okay? And the first and the second estate were not willing to subject to any taxes, and they advised Louis the 16th of convening the Estates General. So from 1614 to 1789, till fresh new taxes were being imposed on the third estates, a Estates General was not reconvened. But when matters came to a head and a suggestion was to impose taxes on first and second estates, the first and second estate urged the king to reconvene the Estates General. Okay, so however, he was advised against increasing the burden of taxation on the third estate any further and consider imposition of taxes on the first and second estate. Consider imposition of taxes on the first and second estates. However, the clergy and nobility urged the king to reconvene the Estates General to consider the proposal for imposition of new taxes, proposal for imposition of new taxes on first and second estates. Now, what is happening after this? On the advice of the first and second estate, the Estates General was reconvened. Now, see, what was the structure was that the first estate, the second estate, the representatives of the first, the second, and the third estates were called. Okay? And these representatives, there were a total of 300 in the first estate, representatives from the first estate, 300 from the second estate, and 600 from the third estate. The rule of the, and these all would sit separately and vote on the proposal of imposition of new taxes on first and second estate. Now, these 300 representatives represented 1% of the population. They also represented 1% of the population, and they represented 98% of the population. Now, the rule was that if at all any two of the three opposed or supported a particular move, that move or that tax would be imposed. Basically, majority principle. So, if two of the three estates supported or rejected, then that proposal would go through. Quite understandably, the first and second estate, which basically was just 2% of the population, opposed the imposition of new taxes. And even when the third estate was was in favor of imposition of new taxes, it could not happen. So, though this was some weird twisted form of a consultative exercise, there was equal power that was given to the first and second estate, irrespective of their representation in the actual society. So quite understandably, it became very clear by when this parliament was reconvened that basically the first and second estates would outvote the third estate. Okay, and that is why the third estate demanded that rather than sitting separately and voting, all the three estates must sit together and vote. All the three estates must sit together and vote. And if they were to sit together and vote, then 600 would be the representatives from first and second estate, and 600 would be the representatives from the third estate. So they would break the monopoly of the first and second estate, thus pushing in the abolition of the imposition of taxes on first and second estate. So the third estate demanded that the Estates General must be reconvened, where a joint session is held of all the three estates together. But the first and second estates were not open to this. And at this point of time, when the third estates demanded a joint assembly, the king said, okay, we will reconvene a joint assembly after the lunch break, okay, in 1789. And after the lunch break, when the time came for reconvening a joint assembly, the entry of the third estates into the French parliament was banned, or they were disallowed entry into the the French parliament. And thus you see that before they could have a joint session, the entry of the third estate was of the representatives of the third estate was banned, and you see that they could not enter into the Estates General to discuss the question. At this point of time, the representatives of the third assembly of the third estate in 1789 in July, in June 1789, firstly the third estate declared that it does not need the first and second estate. It is the representative of the people, and these 600 representatives are the ones who speak on behalf of the 98% of the population, and they don't need the first and second estate, and they declared themselves as the National Assembly. When they were disallowed an entry into the French Parliament, they reconvened in the adjoining tennis court close to the French Parliament and took what was called as the tennis court oath in June 1789. And with the tennis court oath of in June 1789, they declared themselves as the National Assembly, having the right to decide about the imposition of any new taxes or not. Okay, so this was an open act of defiance, and you see that this was an open act of defiance with which the National Assembly, the Third Estate, termed itself as the National Assembly. That is happening in June 1789. Now, obviously, the king and the first and the second estates are not going to simply look at this, and the king now calls in the army in Paris. Okay, in Paris, the army is called, and when the army is called, this information when reaches the National Assembly, the leaders of the National Assembly or the Third Estate now support a wider uprising, which was one which initially began on the issue of food shortages. Okay, and the high prices and food shortages because of the famines and droughts, and and because of these food shortages, this uprising was supported by the National Assembly. And you see that in July there is the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille prison was a French prison in the city of Paris, and this Bastille prison was the prison where a number of political prisoners were kept, and most importantly, a large number of arms were stored. Okay, and this prison was in Paris, and as there was anyways a shortage of food and people did come out on the street in large numbers, on the other side, the National Assembly supported this uprising, and the French army was sent in to crush this uprising. All of this is happening at the same time, and you see that the National Assembly led uprising storms the Bastille, looted the weapons, freed a few political prisoners who were there. And you see that the storming of Bastille was an open challenge to the might of the French crown, where the National Assembly now took the matters in its own hand, and this was a clear open challenge. And that is why the storming of Bastille is widely celebrated in the French society as the beginning of the French Revolution. Okay, so the storming of Bastille is something that is happening. Now, with the storming of Bastille, it is becoming clear that the National Assembly is not going to bow down. And at this point of time, the king, Louis XVI, is the one who now says that, okay, we will have a joint session, okay, including the first and the second estates. And that is why by August 4th, you see that on August 4, a number of declarations were signed by this joint session, which marked an end from the era of the past. For example, feudalism was officially declared as abolished. The guild system was said to be done away with. The idea of or the role of the church in judicial matters was brought to an end. And you see that also there is a idea, because the first and the second estates would be abolished, then everybody would be subjected to a burden of taxation also. So you see that there was a landmark break from the past, which was sought with this assembly in 1789, okay, by August 4th, and then later by August 14th. Now, by 1789, this is something that is happening, and there is also what is the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen coming into existence, which proclaims the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this is where things have only begun, because this is a beginning of a long journey where abhi monarchy has not been overthrown. Okay, so the overthrow monarchy has not happened, but you see that there is a movement towards empowerment of the masses. The Third Estates had declared themselves as the National Assembly, and this does not stop here. Okay, but let's first write down this much, then we'll carry forward the period after 1789. Any doubts still here? Firstly, देखिए, फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन इज अ बिग टॉपिक, ठीक है, उसमें बहुत सारी चीज़ें हैं. वन इज नेपोलियन, वन इज कॉजेज ऑफ फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन, अदर इज इवेंट्स ऑफ फ्रेंच रेवोल्यूशन, देन देयर इज द कांग्रेस ऑफ वियना. Okay, so it's a relatively large topic, but iske baad wale sare topics are small. Okay, so after this, in fact, all other topics are relatively smaller topics except the French revolutions. This will take some time, but beyond this, I mean, okay, let me tell you something interesting. Again, when you look at, for example, you look at India today, the burden of taxation, again, is highly unequal, right? You see that the top 1% of the population is one which has 50% of the wealth, more than 50% of the wealth. Here, top 2% has 60%. In India, top 1% has more than 50%. Okay, so economic inequality is, and that is why if you look at, right, the Gini coefficient of India, you will find that among established democracies, India has the highest Gini coefficient in the world. Among established democracies, जहाँ होता है हर 5 साल में election, ऐसे नहीं कि एक बार हुआ फिर अगली बार नहीं हुआ. Okay, so those countries which have a remarkable degree of continuity of fresh and free and fair elections, India has the highest Gini coefficient. China also has a higher Gini coefficient than India, but China is not a democracy. Okay, so that's there. Now, basically, when you look in India also, there is a very high burden of taxation on the salaried middle class. And for example, forget GST, but you look at direct taxes, that is where the hollowness of the tax base comes out. It's hardly not even 5% of the population which pays direct tax. It's hardly 5% of the population which is paying direct tax. Why? Because of the reason that the business community as well as the highly salaried professionals or the big capitalist owners are the ones who escape paying any taxes at all. Okay, and the result is that the burden of direct taxation is falling on the salaried middle class. The agrarian sector is completely in crisis. They cannot afford to pay the taxes. Okay, apart from those big politicians who have few lands and they convert their other income into and show it as agrarian income. But the agrarian worker has no ability to pay taxes. And how much of the GDP does agrarian contribute?
19.
No, the contribution of agrarian, of agriculture to Indian GDP is how much? No, it's not 2% also. It's roughly in the tune of 15 to 20%. And it contributes to almost 50% of the population, right? At the same point of time, when you look at manufacturing, it is contributing 16%, right, of the GDP. And again, roughly, it contributes, 16% of the GDP and 20% of the population. So even the wages of the workers in the industrial sector are not very high. Okay, so even they do not have the ability to pay that much of taxes. But who is paying then the direct tax? The direct tax is being paid by the salaried middle class, okay, which is paying the direct taxes. Okay, but where is the major share of the GDP is in the services sector. But the services sector is the one where you see that most of these owners of big industries and these companies themselves pay little tax. Corporate tax is there, okay, and so is direct tax, and then there is indirect tax, okay. But direct income tax paid by individuals is substantially only being paid by the salaried middle class. The contribution of corporate tax is also not very great, and majority it is either the indirect tax, things like excise tax, service tax, petrol tax, this tax, that tax, every tax, all the indirect taxes, and the income tax, which is being paid only by, and that is why when you look at the direct tax to GDP ratio in India, it is one of the lowest in the world. Okay, tax to GDP ही हमारा बहुत खराब है. Okay, it's almost roughly around 10%, 10.5 around percent of the is the tax to GDP ratio, which is one of the lowest. Okay, in the in mature economies. At the same point of time, this tax to GDP is to be broken into direct and indirect taxes. When you look at the direct tax to GDP ratio, it is even lesser. And that is why also it has been time and again argued that if the taxation system has to be made more just, GST is not going to do it. what is going to do it is a reform of direct taxation. Okay? So that's there. Now, I mean, so if you look, you know, one of the things is that we, at least the salaried middle class, suffers from a very high burden of taxes in India as well. Now, let's, you know, write down, I can go on and on about it, but again, it's not needed. Now, basically, if you, let's complete what we need to write here is, however, the clergy and nobility argued that the king urged the king to reconvene the Estates General to consider the proposal for imposition of new taxes in the first and second estate. When the Estates General was reconvened, the first and second estates sitting separately vetoed any proposal for imposition of new taxes on any proposal for imposition of new taxes on clergy and nobility. Thus, the third estate demanded a convening of a joint assembly to consider any fresh proposals. To consider any fresh proposals. Okay? That's something that they demanded. Okay. So, pen is discharged, so I can't write for 5 minutes. We'll probably talk about what needs to be. I don't want to write on the board. It's actually more painful, and you also find it more painful to read, right? So, now, no break. There's no question of break. देखिए break लेंगे तो और खिंचेगा. देखिए one thing also is that I hear for example, okay, one thing, yeah, there's also something I wanted to talk. One of the suggestions that was received as I was also told yesterday itself, that you know, there was some amount of concern to some of the students that you know, not everything which is given you know, in the study material that you get is actually getting covered in the class. It's not meant to happen that way, firstly. Not everything which is going to be given is going to be covered in the class because of two reasons. Firstly, that there is a limitation of time. Okay. Also, what is given exactly in the order is not exactly how I'm going to cover it. For example, in your syllabus, in the one that you see, you know, the material that you get, Enlightenment thinkers, all of these things are given later, and American Revolution is given somewhere else, and Industrial Revolution is given even later, and feudalism is given at the start. So a lot of things will not exactly proceed in the order that it is given in the material. By and large it would, lekin you will see some amount of up and down happening. Also, you know, there would be certain topics where I would only faintly touch, not going into an in-depth discussion of them, because there is a limitation of time as well. However, and that is why it has been, you know, given in the study material that if you wish to read, that is something that is over and above which is being done in the class. So, I mean, it's definitely important that you go through the study material, but don't merely use it as a checklist. ये हो गया, ये हो गया, ये हो गया, ये हो गया. Okay, don't use it just as a checklist. Use it as a complementary source. That, see, whatever to the best of my ability that time permits, I would try to cover in the class, and cover, I would say very frankly, of whatever is given there, roughly around 90% or so of it. Okay, but not exactly completely word by word every topic or every subtopic of it. And to do that basically would require more classes. That's not an issue. We can always have more classes. But one thing that you must remember, that comprehensiveness at the cost of dispersing yourself too thinly must never happen in UPSC. To read, that is what basically I'm saying is that to read one fringe topic, you cannot be wasting 2 hours. Why? Because you have a lot of other things to cover also. So in the quest for comprehensiveness, it will become so wide that it will become unwieldy for you to revise also later. So the whole, how do you approach this problem then, is that if at all there is something that is not covered in the class, and because whatever is important, whatever has been asked before or is likely to be asked, something that I would cover. But over and above things, for example, say about Africa, okay, or some details about Africa. So as I told you, even the question which came this year could be written with other knowledge of world history, even without discussing Africa in general. One was from NAM. Other things also, for example, we'll talk about the Moroccan crisis, okay, later in World War I. That was Morocco also. अगर बस इतना मैप में पता होना चाहिए कि मोरक्को नॉर्थ अफ्रीका में आता है, बस इतना ही पता होना चाहिए क्योंकि Moroccan crisis is something that we discuss very strongly in World War I as one of the causes. Okay, even if you know that much, that is enough. So a lot of things can be answered even with an application of what you know. Need not be discussed everything word by word in the class. So for example, I've told you about enlightenment, right? In your study material, you will find a few pages given about enlightenment. Now if I have to dictate, I cannot be taking one class on enlightenment, Renaissance and all of that, because that painfully, increases the time period. So there will be, a part restriction on covering everything, but so as to ensure more time is given on things which are more important, and the less important things which I'm leaving behind. If you wish, you can read them from the document, and if you have doubts, come with me. I'm there after the class. So that you can ask, okay? So now,
what kind of questions do you ask in concepts revolution?
So what are the kinds of questions that are being asked that we'll keep writing? No, questions, okay, questions from here are mostly of a direct nature. There is not too much of, twisting of questions that you see from world history, from your examination point of view. They are going to be direct only. On causes, consequences, and significance, that is it, most of the questions are going to be. Not like we are discussing in modern Indian history, okay? That's there. Now, okay, you write down, I'll dictate. So, the third estates demanded a convening of a joint assembly to consider any fresh proposals for taxation. Any fresh proposals for taxation. The next point that you write is that on being denied an entry upon reconvening on being denied an entry upon reconvening in June 1789, the Third Estate assembled in the nearby tennis court to declare themselves as the National Assembly with the tennis court oath. The National Assembly argued that it represented the wishes of the people and supported imposition of new taxes on first and second estate. The king brought in the French army to deal with the public protests supported by the National Assembly, supported by the National Assembly, supported by the National Assembly in Paris against the high prices and food shortages. July 1789 saw the storming of the storming of the Bastille. The storming of the Bastille by an uprising led by National Assembly in Paris. They looted the weapons and freed the political prisoners, which marked an open challenge to the monarchy in France. Now, in August 4 and then August 14th, 1789, a joint convention of the three estates was a joint convention of the three estates was called, which agreed to A, bring an end to feudalism in France, abolish the guild system, bring an end to feudalism in France, abolish the guild system, abolish the role of church in judicial and political matters, and supported establishment of constitutional monarchy. Supported the establishment of a constitutional monarchy. Also, a provisional government under a national assembly and constitutional monarchy was to be set up. Now, basically what was done was that the National Assembly was to become the provisional government, was to form the provisional government. The king would still be there, the king was not overthrown, but the king's powers were vastly reduced. And you see that this is where is the beginning of the French Revolution. But the story has just begun, because from 1789, the whole process for the eventual establishment of actually a democracy in France goes on till 1871. Okay, it's a very long process. Okay, but you see the major beginning is one which is happening here. Firstly, the first phase of the French Revolution thus did not argue for an overthrow of the monarchy, but a conversion of absolute monarchy into constitutional monarchy. Okay, so that is what was the argument. However, now this is not an easy affair. However, this is not an easy affair. Why? Because now, when the National Assembly comes to power, you see, one last point also that you must learn here. With these changes, a declaration of rights of man and citizen was adopted, which was to uphold the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Okay? Now, here, what is happening after this is that the National Assembly now has the one which is formed the provisional government, but you see that when this is happening in France, two major neighbors of France are viewing with these developments with much concern, okay, and that is Austria and Prussia, okay. Prussia is not something that exists today. Prussia was the later one which formed Germany, Okay, so Prussia and Austria. So basically, you see that in France, the neighbors were Prussia and Austria. In France, the king was, again, it's not important to remember, but Louis XVI was the king. Okay, the French king in 1789 is Louis XVI. The Austrian king is Leopold II. And here it's Frederick William II. Okay. Now, Louis XVI's wife is Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette, she is the sister of Leopold, King Leopold II of Austria. So Louis XVI क्या हुआ? CSAT. Brother-in-law, right? So Louis XVI is brother-in-law of Leopold. So while the powers of Louis XVI are being vastly curtailed, this is something which is being viewed with much concern in both Prussia and Austria. Why? Because of two reasons. Prussia and Austria do not want such ideas to be imbibed by their subjects, because these are also monarchies. Already there was the American Revolution. Now 10 years later, similar thing is going to happen in France. But American Revolution was at least afar. If something was of such a domestic upheaval was to happen in France, then Austria and this could inspire similar movements across Austria and Prussia as well. So they wanted that Austria and Prussia did not want the monarchy to be reduced to nothing in France. Okay. Also, King Louis XVI was related to Austria. Okay. And at this point of time, in 1790, and though the provisional government came, the provisional government was established by the National Assembly after 1789 onwards. By 1791, you see the declaration of Pillnitz. Okay, and with the declaration of Pillnitz, basically Prussia and Austria declared that Prussia and Austria declared that they would launch a war against France and will overthrow the National Assembly and will restate the full monarchy or an absolute monarchy here. Okay. Now, Louis XVI, Louis XVI is the one who's still a monarch, but his powers have been vastly curtailed. Now, at this point of time, when this is, what is happening, you see that ultimately with the declaration of Pillnitz, Prussia and Austria actually launch a war. Okay. Now, before this, France had already planned, the National Assembly had already planned, though the National Assembly had come into power, it was still dealing with a lot of problems. Even though they had vastly reduced the power of the king, the major concerns of the people were yet to be addressed. What were the major concerns of people? Why all of this is happening? Because the burden taxation and all of that is there. But the immediate reason is actually food shortages, okay, and high prices and inflation. So these food shortages, high prices, inflation were yet to be solved significantly, and agricultural produce was yet to pick up. Industrial produce was yet to pick up. So major of the problems were still not addressed, and at this point of time, the National Assembly decided to actually attack Austria. Before Austria and Prussia had declared, the National Assembly was planning or was considering whether or not to attack Austria. Why? Because they could plunder Austria and loot basically some of the wealth to deal with their economic crisis back home, and also probably export the similar ideas which had taken hold in France. But even before that could happen, Prussia and Austria joined hands and with the declaration of Pillnitz attacked France. At this point of time, Louis XVI tries to escape. And Louis XVI tries to escape to Austria. However, this escape is unsuccessful and he is captured by the National Assembly and brought back to Paris. Okay. Now, he is brought back to Paris, but this potential escape that Louis XVI was planning shook the faith of the masses in the Bourbon dynasty. And you see that now is the time when you see that Louis XVI's time has come. And now, basically, you see that in 1789, those who had formed the National Assembly, they were one of the sections who had led the French Revolution. They were another set of revolutionaries also, which were the ones who were of a more radical nature. Okay, and these revolutionaries who were of a more radical nature, they did not want constitutional monarchy. They wanted a full republic. Okay, but it was the National Assembly which had managed to control power. Okay, and that is why they established the constitutional monarchy. But there was a strong demand by this radical section, and these were the ones which are called as the Jacobians, which demanded abolishment of constitutional monarchy and establishment of full-fledged republic. Also, they demanded that anybody who opposes the establishment of republic must also be assassinated. Okay, and who is opposing the French Revolution and the establishment of republic must also be assassinated. And so they made these demands to the National Assembly. Okay, the National Assembly, and so they protested against the National Assembly, which was not establishing a constitutional, which was in favor of establishing a constitutional monarchy. So the National Assembly, in turn, attacked and the Jacobians itself, and you see that there was a police firing in Paris against the protests against the Jacobians, in which a number of Jacobians were killed. So you see that what is beginning to be clear now, that the easy part was over. The difficult part had just begun of what exactly was to happen once the monarchy was either reduced or overthrown. But the Jacobians demanded that now, and already the Jacobians had demanded the establishment of a republic. And now with the monarchy betraying the trust of the people, there was a demand of the traitors to be punished. And this was to start with the killing of the king itself. And you see that there was a vote which was done, a narrow vote, a small voting exercise which was done within the National Assembly. And the decision to assassinate, to hang, to actually kill and guillotine Louis XVI was passed with a margin of 1 vote. Okay, and just with 1 vote margin, his decision to assassinate Louis XVI for his betrayal of the revolution was passed, and Louis XVI was guillotined at this point of time. Okay, and in and thus you see that by 1791, that is what is happening, that he is being guillotined. And now, if the king himself could be assassinated, then anybody who was considered as a opposer of the French Revolution, as the opposer of the idea of the establishment of a republic, could be assassinated. So from 1792 onwards to 1794, in a span of 2 years, the Jacobians assassinated more than 20,000 people in France who were considered as against the French Revolution, which included members from the First Estate, Second Estate, Third Estate, everywhere. Okay, and basically you see that this is what was called as the Reign of Terror. Okay, this is what was called as the Reign of Terror, which was unleashed on France by the Jacobians, and who were being led by Maximil Robespierre. So he was the one who is actually, the one who's in charge of all these, of the Reign of Terror. To basically, Maximil Robespierre was also a part of the Committee of Public Safety. Okay, this Committee of Public Safety, yeah, I know that sounds contradictory, but that is what it was. The Committee of Public Safety was established basically to deal with any, to maintain law and order and to deal with any opposer of the French Revolution. So what is very clear that from 1789 to 1794, more than 4.5 to 5 years had passed, and still the major problems of the, because of which the French Revolution had begun, were yet to be solved. And unless and on the other hand, what you see was initially an attempt to establish a constitutional monarchy. When that failed, was an attempt to establish a republican form of government. And at the same point of time, there was a mass unleashing of violence, including the reign of terror. Now, also, one thing that I've not explained till now is what happens in this war. What happens in this war is, and this is the first European coalition. What happened in this war, this is the first of the wars. ऐसा बहुत सारे लड़ाई होना है अभी. There are 4 wars, there are 4 European coalitions which are going to happen, in which attempts would be made by either France to subdue its neighbors, or the neighbors of France to subdue the French Revolution and the idea of establishing a republic in France. This is the first of the 4. Okay, and you see that the first European coalition was when an attempt was made by Prussia and Austria to defeat France. But the French forces then, under the National Assembly control, managed to prevent the invasion from Prussia and Austria. How? Because of, firstly, the National Assembly and the French army enjoyed widespread public support in 1789, where the French army was seen as defending the French Revolution from the outside invaders. That was one thing. The second thing was also leadership of the French, including the role that was played by Napoleon here. Napoleon was, and we'll talk about Napoleon later, but Napoleon was also a soldier in the French army. And before the French Revolution, the higher positions within the French army, the French administration, civil services, etc., all of them were restricted only to the first and second estate. But Napoleon himself came from the third estate. So he could never be a general within the French army. But with the French Revolution, he was also now eligible, and even the higher administrative positions were thrown open to the third estate. And in the war of the first European coalition, Napoleon played an important role in defending France from the joint attempts of Prussia and Austria. So even with the first European coalition, you also see the rise of Napoleon as a process that began. Okay, so you see that he also played a very important role in preventing this joint invasion by Prussia and Austria into France. So France, with the first European coalition, managed to defend the revolution. The National Assembly finally overthrew the constitutional monarchy, and now was in direction of moving to establish the republic. The Jacobeans unleashed a reign of terror, and you see that by 1794, though the monarchy has been finally overthrown, the establishment of a republic is nowhere in sight. Okay, and a republic which could address the major problems because of which the French Revolution had begun. Let's write down this much. Okay.
So Austria and Prussia are trying to help Louis XVI. Then why is he trying to escape from France?
Why he is trying to escape? Okay, so what he's asking is that Austria and Prussia are trying to help Louis XVI. Then why is he escaping from France? He is escaping from France because it was not clear to him as to what would be the fate if it became clear that that if at all Prussia and Austria were to withdraw, or to Louis, what would be the fate of the king. Okay, so that is why, given the point at this time when the conflict broke out, he found it wise to escape to Austria, and if at all Austrian and Prussian forces were successful, he would be reinstalled on the throne. Okay, that's the reason. Any other doubts still here?
So the Bastille prison was seen more as a fear to the people of France. So attacking it, I read it somewhere that attacking it was overcoming the fear of the suppression by the king. This would be used as like a reference point for how important the Bastille prison attack was.
See how important was the Bastille prison? Now, as I told you that attacking, it is commonly argued that attacking the Bastille prison was an attack on the French symbol of power, because only the political prisoners were kept here, not the routine prisoners, those who had conspired against the French state, and only those, and also it was a vast storehouse of weaponry located very close to the palace in Paris. So an attack on the Bastille prison was also considered as an attack on the French might. That is what we also wrote, that this was what was basically seen as the major step where you see the outbreak of the French Revolution. So that's that.
And one more is lavish lifestyle of Marie Antoinette.
That will write in the causes, that the lavish lifestyle of Marie Antoinette and the French monarchy, where they maintained a very lavish lifestyle even while the masses were suffering from high burden of taxation, food shortages, etc. That's one of the additional causes for the causes of the French Revolution. That we'll write later. Okay. So let's firstly complete this, that with the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, there are a few other things we've not talked about, that as for example, how revolutionary was the French Revolution. The similar question that I told you, right, was American Revolution, that how revolutionary was the American Revolution. A similar question can also be framed about the French Revolution as well. Okay, so that we'll talk about later. Okay, so what is seen is that after this, in 1791, just a second, where did we stop? Yeah, so yeah, I just saw that. So in 1791, we see that with the declaration of Pillnitz, Prussia and Austria declared their intention of reinstating monarchy Declaration of Pillnitz, Prussia and Austria declared their intention of reinstating the monarchy in France, and thus attacked France. The French forces managed to repel the joint effort of Prussian and Austrian forces and defended the National Assembly's control. Napoleon played a key role in this war. Now, what also happens after this is that in 1792, Louis XVI attempted to escape from France to Austria. He was captured and brought back to Paris, where he was eventually assassinated by the Committee of Public Safety, dominated by the more radical faction of French Revolution, that is the Jacobians. See, the Jacobians are not all bad people also, okay? The Jacobians, I mean, it's not that, that the Jacobians did unleash a reign of terror, but the Jacobians had more radical ideas as well. We'll talk about how revolutionary was the French Revolution, where we'll see that the French Revolution did not bring about any radical land reforms, but the Jacobians argued for a radical land reforms. The Jacobians also argued for a grant, the Jacobians argued for a radical land reform. That was something that was never brought about by the National Assembly. So, so the demands were radical, and also their approach was authoritarian in many ways, but they were both the sides, to them. Now, basically that is something that is happening in 1792. From 1792 to 1794, a reign of terror was unleashed by the Jacobians, in which more than 20,000 people coming from the first, second and third estates, those who were perceived as a threat to the French Revolution were assassinated. Okay? So, that's something which is happening here. Now, so that is something which is happening here. Just a second. The class is not over. Clarifying. I just need to pick up this call. We'll carry on for 15 more minutes. 15. Yeah. Basically, so that's something that is there. Now, what we'll do is we'll just watch a small brief video, which is, again, we'll just sum up all the causes of the French Revolution. And just a second. So the other thing which is going on these days is ancient history. See, environment and ecology is very important, okay? It's supremely important for your prelims examination, okay? And though it's another matter that at times the questions are so tough that, you just can't help it. Okay, in terms of any environmental legislation or conference, etc. But it is one area which will shortly remain important. Okay, because till the time forests service is also having the same prelims examination, questions from environment are inevitable. Okay, so that's one thing that you should probably continue with great emphasis. And उसमें भी दोनों चीजें important है. One is your whole thing of environmental legislations. Usse also repeatedly you see questions, but also from these concepts, right? Of jo whatever they are, ecotone, I don't even remember now, but whatever, ecological pyramid, all of that, rule of 10%, whatever, they are there, right? All those things are also asked. And as far as one thing is concerned, okay, remembering name of endangered species, etc., is not that important. Okay, उसमें से अगर एक क्वेश्चन आ भी रहा है और आप 100 नाम आपको रिमेंबर करना है तो it's not possible. Okay, even if you have some faint idea, you can make a guess. हो गया सही तो ठीक है. Otherwise, that's not something that you must, because I've seen a lot of students wasting unnecessary time on, sir, which names to remember. It's nobody can tell with surety. If something is coming in the newspaper, maximum you can, look at that. But the more important are the concepts.
What rights do people have, and where do they?
So, okay, and polity has been done, economy, geography also done. So by and large, a lot of things have been, society also done. So रह क्या गया? Ethics. Okay. IR, post-independence, ethics. Okay. So Neeraj sir has taken culture.
Yes, sir.
Culture हो गया, लेकिन ancient अभी नहीं हुआ है.
Maybe that is starting from it.
Okay, and ethics is going to start in November. I think November. I think the first thing that's starting in November when Suraj sir is available, I think is ethics itself. So, when is your course due to get completed?
January, Feb 10.
So then obviously you have enough time. हो जाएगा.
What rights do people have, and where do they come from? Who gets to make decisions for others, and on what authority? And how can we organize society to meet people's needs? These questions challenged an entire nation during the upheaval of the French Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, Europe had undergone a profound intellectual and cultural shift known as the Enlightenment. Philosophers and artists promoted reason and human freedom over tradition and religion. The rise of a middle class and printed materials encouraged political awareness, and the American Revolution had turned a former English colony into an independent republic. Yet France, one of the largest and richest countries in Europe, was still governed by an ancient regime of 3 rigid social classes called estates. The monarch, King Louis XVI, based his authority on divine right and granted special privileges to the first and second estates, the Catholic clergy and the nobles. The third estate, middle-class merchants and craftsmen, as well as over 20 million peasants, had far less power. And they were the only ones who paid taxes, not just to the king, but to the other estates as well. In bad harvest years, taxation could leave peasants with almost nothing, while the king and nobles lived lavishly on their extracted wealth. But as France sank into debt due to its support of the American Revolution and its long-running war with England, change was needed. King Louis appointed Finance Minister Jacques Necker, who pushed for tax reforms and won public support by openly publishing the government's finances. But the king's advisors strongly opposed these initiatives. Desperate for a solution, the king called a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the three estates, for the first time in 175 years. Although the Third Estate represented 98% of the French population, its vote was equal to each of the other estates. And unsurprisingly, both of the upper classes favored keeping their privileges. Realizing they couldn't get fair representation, the Third Estate broke off, declared themselves the National Assembly, and pledged to draft a new constitution, with or without the other estates. King Louis ordered the First and Second Estates to meet with the National Assembly, but he also dismissed Necker, his popular finance minister. In response, thousands of outraged Parisians joined with sympathetic soldiers to storm the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal power and a large storehouse of weapons. The revolution had begun. As rebellion spread throughout the country, the feudal system was abolished. The Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed a radical idea for the time: that individual rights and freedoms were fundamental to human nature, and government existed only to protect them. Their privileges gone, many nobles fled abroad, begging foreign rulers to invade France and restore order. And while Louis remained as the figurehead of the constitutional monarchy, he feared for his future. In 1791, he tried to flee the country, but was caught. The attempted escape shattered people's faith in the king. The royal family was arrested, and the king charged with treason. After a trial, the once revered king was publicly beheaded, signaling the end of 1,000 years of monarchy and finalizing the September 21st declaration of the First French Republic, governed by the motto Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. 9 months later, Queen Marie Antoinette, a foreigner long mocked as Madame Deficit for her extravagant reputation, was executed as well. But the revolution would not end there. Some leaders, not content with just changing the government, sought to completely transform French society. Its religion, its street names, even its calendar. As multiple factions formed, the extremist Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, launched a reign of terror to suppress the slightest dissent, executing over 20,000 people before the Jacobins' own downfall. Meanwhile, France found itself at war with neighboring monarchs seeking to strangle the revolution before it spread. Amidst the chaos, a general named Napoleon Bonaparte took charge, becoming emperor as he claimed to defend the revolution's democratic values. All in all, the revolution saw 3 constitutions and 5 governments within 10 years, followed by decades alternating between monarchy and revolt before the next republic formed in 18